I remember the day the sun forgot to rise in my heart. The air felt heavy the way grief presses against the ribs. When love turns away, I stood by the window watching the sky melt into gold, my hands trembling around a chipped cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The house that once echoed with laughter now sighed with silence, each wall whispering the ghosts of a family. I thought I knew my daughter stood before me, her eyes sharp with words she had never dared to speak. Before you are useless, she said, her voice shaking with anger or maybe shame. I could not tell. She looked at me as if I were a stranger who had wandered too far into her life, as if my years of sacrifice had turned invisible, as if the hands that had held her when she cried now meant nothing at all. I wanted to tell her how I once stayed up every night sewing clothes so she could wear something new for school, how I skipped meals so she could have seconds, how I whispered prayers into the dark so she would never feel the cold bite of the world. But my words stayed trapped inside my chest. They tangled with the ache in my throat until all I could do was breathe. She pointed toward the door and I saw her lips move again. I want you out, just like that, as if the mother she once loved was now a burden. She could no longer carry my world tilted, and suddenly the walls that had held my laughter felt foreign. The home that had been my temple felt like a cage I had to leave. I gathered what little was mine, a faded shawl, an old photograph, a Bible with worn edges, the scent of her childhood still clinging faintly to its pages. Outside, the wind was cold and wild. It bit at my face as if the world wanted to test how much more I could bear. I walked down the street, not knowing where my feet would take me, each step a question, each breath a plea. The city lights blurred into a river of gold and blue. I thought of every birthday I had planned, every bedtime story I had whispered when she was too scared to sleep, and I wondered when love had changed its shape, when it had turned into something sharp enough to wound, but deep inside something small and fierce began to stir, a voice quiet yet steady. You are not useless, you are not finished, you are the sum of every sunrise you survived, and this too shall not be your ending. I found a bench near the edge of the park. The night hummed softly like an old song, the stars blinked down if they knew my name, and I sat there wrapped in my shawl, holding the silence like a child who needed comfort. In that stillness, I began to remember who I was, not just a mother, not just someone's discarded love, but a woman forged in the fire of survival, a woman who had carried storms in her bones and still found ways to bloom. The night stretched long like a road without end. I sat beneath the trembling sky, my breath turning into mist that rose and vanished like unspoken prayers. The park around me whispered in the language of rustling leaves and lonely wind, every sound a reminder of how quiet life becomes when love forgets your name. But somewhere in that stillness, I felt the pulse of my own heart steady and alive, a reminder that even in exile, there is a heartbeat that refuses to surrender. I closed my eyes and saw her face, my daughter, as a child running through fields of summer light. Her laughter soft like bells, her hands reaching for mine, as if I were the only world she knew. And I wondered how time had stolen that tenderness and replaced it with distance, how the girl who once clung to my skirt now looked at me with cold eyes that no longer saw a mother. Tears gathered, but I did not let them fall. They would not be tears of despair, they would be the water that feeds the roots of my becoming, because deep within me something ancient began to stir, the spirit of every woman who had been told she was too small, too weak, too useless, and yet stood again when the world tried to bury her. The wind grew stronger, it sang around me like a chorus of unseen voices, and I felt them, the mothers before me, the grandmothers, the forgotten women who built homes out of nothing. But will their whispers moved through the night do not be broken? They said, do not be ashamed, rise, because you are made of more than they will ever understand. So I rose slowly like dawn, rising over a quiet lake, each breath a vow, each step a promise to myself. I would not wait for her to see my worth, I would show it, by living it, by breathing it into every sunrise that followed. I walked until my feet found a small church at the edge of town. Its doors were open, the light spilling onto the cold stone like a warm invitation. Inside it smelled of candle wax and old wood, the air heavy with the kind of silence that heals. I knelt at the front, not to ask for rescue, but to thank the heavens for the strength that still lived within me, for the courage to keep walking when the world turned away. The morning came softly, the sky brushed with pink and silver, the world slowly waking, and for the first time in years I felt something that tasted like peace. It was small and fragile, but it was real, a single breath that said, "You are still here." I found work at a diner near the edge of the city. The pay was small, but the people were kind. They smiled at me, not as a burden, but as someone who mattered. Each day, I wiped tables, poured coffee, and listened to the hum of strangers sharing their stories, and in those ordinary moments I felt a quiet grace. I was rebuilding not with grand gestures, but with small acts of purpose. Each plate I carried was a stone in the foundation of my new life. Each smile exchanged was a thread in the tapestry of who I was becoming. And though my heart still ached for the daughter who had cast me out, I began to understand that forgiveness does not mean returning to pain. It means freeing your spirit from the weight of sorrow. As the days turned into weeks, I saw myself reflected in the faces of other women, tired eyes, gentle smiles, hearts that had known loss yet refused to stop loving. We carried the same story written in different hands, the story of falling and rising again. The air changed one morning, soft wind brushing against my cheek, carrying the scent of rain and memory. The sky hung low and gray, like the world was holding its breath. I was wiping down the counter of the diner when the door opened and time itself seemed to pause. She stood there, my daughter, her face pale, her eyes searching for something she had once thrown away. For a moment, neither of us moved. The hum of voices around us faded into nothing, just the rhythm of my own heartbeat echoing in the space between us. She looked older than I remembered, not in years, but in the weight she carried behind her gaze. Life had touched her, and not gently. She whispered my name softly, like a prayer that had been forgotten too long, and I saw her hands tremble. She said she was sorry. Her voice cracked like thin glass. She said she had been angry, tired, blinded by her own pride, and she had not seen the woman who had given her everything. I stood still, letting her words drift through the air like fragile feathers. Part of me wanted to reach for her, to wrap her in the arms that once promised protection from every storm, but another part of me stood rooted in the soil of my new strength, the part that had learned that love without respect is not love at all. She told me her husband had left the house, had grown quiet and cold. She had realized what I had carried all those years, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the silent prayers, and the emptiness she felt now was the echo of what she had taken for granted. Tears shimmered in her eyes and fell onto her hands. She said she went to my old room and found it empty, the walls bare, the memories gone, and she had felt the kind of loneliness that does not need words to be understood, a loneliness that only a mother's absence can bring. I looked at her and saw not the child who betrayed me, but the woman who had finally begun to see. And in that moment, I understood something sacred, that pain is not a punishment, it is a teacher, and both of us had learned. I told her I forgave her, not because she deserved it, but because my heart deserved peace. I told her I had built a life from the ashes she left me, that I had found purpose in places I never thought to look, that I no longer waited for anyone to tell me I mattered, because I had learned to tell myself. She wept. Way a soul weeps when it finally breaks open, and I held her not as a mother who had been wronged, but as a woman who had learned compassion through fire. Her tears soaked into my shoulder, and I felt the past begin to dissolve like frost melting under the sun. We sat for a long time, no more words needed. The diner around us hummed back to life. Coffee cups clinked, spoons stirred, and life continued unbothered by our reunion. But inside me, the world shifted. The ache that had once been my companion softened into something tender and calm. That night, I walked home alone, the moon high above the city, painting silver across the wet pavement, each step slow, steady, deliberate. And I realized that forgiveness is not returning to where you were, it is walking forward with a heart that has healed. She called me the next morning, her voice gentler than I had ever heard. She asked if she could visit, if she could come just to talk, and I said yes, because love rebuilt is stronger than love untested. Morning light poured through the curtains like liquid gold. It touched the floor, the walls, the small table where I kept a single white flower in a glass jar. Everything seemed quieter, softer, as if the world itself had paused to listen. I sat by the window, wrapped in my shawl, sipping tea that tasted of peace, and when I heard the gentle knock at the door, my heart whispered, she has come. When I opened the door, she stood there, my daughter, her hair loose, her eyes filled with a light I had not seen since she was small behind that light. There was still sorrow and shame, but also hope, the kind of hope that grows only after rain has fallen for too long. We stood for a moment in silence, and then she stepped forward, her arms trembling as she wrapped them around me, and I felt her heartbeat against mine. Rhythm familiar as my own. We did not speak. We simply breathed, letting the years between us dissolve into the air inside. She looked around at my small home, at the plants by the window, the books stacked neatly, the scent of fresh bread filling the room. She said softly, "It feels warm here." I smiled. Because warmth does not come from walls or windows, it comes from hearts that have learned to forgive themselves. We sat together and shared stories of her struggles, of my quiet victories, of all the little moments that had shaped us. Since that day, she called me useless. She told me she could not sleep. That night that she had seen the empty space where my shoes once stood, and it felt like a wound she could not close, I listened, not to judge but to understand, because every heart has its breaking point, and every soul its way of returning home, and sometimes the road to forgiveness is walked in silence. She asked if I could ever love her the same, and I told her love is not a flame that dies, it is the sun, even when clouds hide it. It waits patiently behind the sorrow until the sky clears. We cooked together that afternoon, laughed quietly as flour covered our hands. The smell of bread and butter filled the air, and I felt something sacred, a new beginning written not in promises, but in presence, not in grand gestures, but in small kindnesses. She told me she wanted to take me home, that she had cleaned my old room and planted roses outside the window. I looked at her with gentle eyes. It said, "My home is wherever there is peace, but I will come visit, because love does not always mean going back. Sometimes it means walking beside each other." In a new way she nodded, tears glimmering again. And in her eyes I saw the woman she was becoming, stronger, softer, wiser, the kind of woman I had always prayed she would be. That evening, when she left, she held my hand for a long time, her voice quiet, "I love you." And I felt those words settle deep within me, not as apology, but as truth. After she was gone, I sat by the window once more, the sun melting into the horizon, the city humming its endless song, and I whispered into the fading light, "Thank you for the pain that became my teacher. Thank you for the loss that became my awakening. Thank you for the love that returned when I had learned to love myself first, because in the end the story was never about being thrown away. It was about being found. It was about a woman who lost everything she thought defined her, and discovered that her worth was never something to be given or taken. It had lived within her all along, and as night settled, I closed my eyes and smiled. The past no longer hurt, it simply existed like an old photograph that no longer bleeds, a reminder of who I was and who I had become. Years have passed since that day when my daughter called me useless and cast me out into the cold. Time has turned my wounds into stories, and my stories into wisdom. The seasons have moved through me like rivers, through stone, shaping me, softening me, but never breaking me. Now I sit on my porch wrapped in the same shawl that once held my tears, and I watch the sun dip low behind the trees. The world hums with quiet life, children's laughter. Somewhere in the distance, the faint toll of a church bell, a reminder that life moves on. Always has. Sometimes she visits with her own children. They run to me, their hands small and warm, their voices bright with joy. They call me grandma and wrap their arms around my neck, as if I am their whole world. And every time they do, I feel a kind of love that erases every trace of bitterness. Through them, I see the circle closing, the generations folding into each other like waves returning to shore. My daughter now sits beside me as the sun fades, her hair touched with silver, her eyes calmer, softer. She often asks me how I forgave her so easily. I smile and tell her forgiveness was never easy. It was necessary, because holding anger is like drinking salt water. It promises relief, but only deepens the thirst. I tell her that when she called me useless, she gave me a strange gift. She pushed me toward the mirror I had been too afraid to look into, and there I found myself, not as a mother, not as a wife, not as someone's shadow, but as a woman, whole and fierce and quiet as dawn. I tell her that strength does not roar, it whispers. It lives in the way you keep breathing, When the world turns cold, it lives in the way you smile at strangers. When your heart still aches, it lives in the way you choose kindness even after betrayal. She listens and her eyes glisten with tears not of regret, but of gratitude, because she knows now that life is not measured by what we lose, but by how we rise again, she says. She tells her children about me, how their grandmother once walked through fire and came out glowing, how she turned exile into rebirth, how she proved that love is never wasted, even when it is thrown away. I look at her, and I see the same fire that once burned in me, and I know that this is how healing moves through blood, quietly, generously, like sunlight, slipping through the cracks of old walls. When night falls, I sit by the window again. The stars scatter like promises across the sky. The moon watches like an old friend, and I whisper to the women who might be listening somewhere out there in the dark, the ones who have been called useless, forgotten, unwanted. I tell them, you are not broken, you are not done, you are the storm and the calm. After you are the beginning that comes after every ending. I tell them that one day their pain will become their poetry, that the world will look at them and see light, because nothing shines brighter than a heart that has survived the night. I tell them that love may wound, but it also rebuilds, that every betrayal can become a bridge if you let it, that no matter who turns you away, the world is still full of doors waiting to open. And as I whisper these things, I feel the universe listening, the trees, the stars, the air itself breathing with me, and I understand at last that my story is no longer just mine. It belongs to every woman who dared to begin again. So I close my eyes and smile, because the past no longer hurts. It sings, it hums in the rhythm of my heartbeat. It tells me that I was never useless. I was simply waiting to remember my own worth, and in that remembering, I became whole, a mother, a woman, a survivor, a flame that never went out. There is a silence that comes after long storms, not the silence of emptiness, but of peace, the kind that hums beneath the surface of the earth. When everything wounded has begun to heal, I live in that silence now, each breath a song of gratitude, each heartbeat a drum, echoing with memory and meaning. Sometimes I walk by the same park where I once sat shivering beneath the stars. The bench still stands, old wood scarred by years of weather and time. I trace my fingers along its surface and whisper, thank you, because that was where I met myself for the first time, where I learned that rock bottom is not an ending. It is a doorway disguised as despair. I see other women. There's sometimes some with heavy eyes, some with trembling hands, and I smile at them with the kind of smile that says, I know what it feels like to be left behind, to be unseen, unheard, unloved, and I know what it means to rise again quietly, not to prove anything, but to simply live. The air smells of rain and wildflowers and forgiveness. The sky stretches wide and open, and I can almost hear the universe breathing with me. Every leaf, every ripple in the water, every gust of wind whispering, you are enough. When I return home, my daughter calls. She tells me she loves me again and again, as if saying it will weave back every thread we lost. And in her voice I hear the sound of redemption, the gentle rhythm of healing, passed from one heart to another. We talk about simple things, the children, the garden, the little bakery that opened down the street, but beneath every word flows a river of understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be real. At night, when the world is quiet, I light a candle by the window. The flame flickers steady and gold. It reminds me of every woman who walks through the night holding her pain like a lantern, lighting her way through darkness with the glow of her own courage. I whisper to them, though they may never hear me, keep walking, keep believing. You are never truly alone, because somewhere another woman is surviving too. Somewhere another heart is mending. Somewhere another story is beginning. And I think that is what it means to live, to keep telling our stories so no one forgets that we were here, that we loved, that we endured, that we rose. Now, when I look back, I do not see tragedy, I see transformation. I see a mother who learned that strength is not loud. It is the quiet decision to stand when your knees still shake. It is the smile you offer when your heart still remembers the pain. It is the grace you carry when you have every reason to be bitter. The wind moves through the trees outside my window, soft, steady, like the whisper of all the women who came before me, and I know their voices will carry long after mine, because once a woman remembers her worth, she becomes eternal. So I sit in the glow of that single flame, the house still, the world gentle, and I breathe in The peace I once thought I would never find, I closed my eyes and whispered to the sky, you called me useless, but I became unstoppable, and somewhere far beyond the horizon the stars burned brighter, as if to say, yes, you were never broken, you were becoming all along.